the edge of barely controlled rage. "Get up! Now!" Becca struggled to regain her footing, her heart pounding as she felt the eyes of dozens of strangers upon them. Jonathan's fingers dug into her arm through the expensive fabric of her maternity dress, the same dress he had chosen for her that morning. "Jonathan, please," she whispered, trying to keep her voice steady. "People are watching." "Let them watch," he hissed, jerking her upright with more force than necessary. "Maybe next time you'll think twice before questioning me in public." Behind the teller window, a man in his early 50s watched the scene unfold with the sharp attention of someone trained to assess threats. General Marcus Sullivan, known to friends and family as Mac, had been working part-time at the bank since his retirement from active Marine duty 6 months ago. The job was supposed to be peaceful, a way to stay busy and serve his community. But right now, every instinct honed by 30 years of military service told him he was witnessing something far from peaceful. Mac's eyes locked with those of the young pregnant woman. Something familiar flickered in her terrified gaze, and recognition hit him like a physical blow. Rebecca Matthews, his sister's daughter, his niece Becca, whom he hadn't seen in over 2 years. She saw him too, and for just a moment, her expression shifted from fear to something like hope. But then she shook her head slightly. The same small gesture she'd used as a child when she didn't want the adults to know about playground bullies or scraped knees she thought she could handle alone. "Ma'am, is everything all right?" Mac called out, stepping from behind the counter. His voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, but his tone remained gentle. Jonathan's head snapped toward him, and Mac saw the calculated assessment in the younger man's eyes. Designer suit, perfect hair, manicured nails, and the kind of smooth confidence that came from never having to worry about consequences. "Everything's fine," Jonathan replied with the practiced smile of someone used to managing public perception. "My wife just had a little dizzy spell. Pregnancy, you know how it is." Mac's trained gaze swept over Becca's appearance. Pale skin, slight tremor in her hands. The way she held herself protectively. The fresh redness on her arm where Jonathan had gripped her. None of it spoke to a simple dizzy spell. "Mrs. Matthews," Max said, using her maiden name deliberately, "would you like to sit down for a moment? We have a comfortable office where you could rest." Becca's eyes widened at the use of her maiden name. Jonathan's grip on her arm tightened almost imperceptibly. "That won't be necessary," Jonathan answered for her, his smile never wavering. "We were just leaving. Come along, Rebecca." But Elena Rodriguez, the bank manager, had been watching the exchange from her office doorway. As a divorced mother who had once worn similar bruises and made similar excuses, she recognized domestic violence when she saw it. "Actually," Elena interjected, stepping forward with professional authority, "bank policy requires us to ensure all customers receive proper assistance if they appear unwell. Mrs. Matthews, please, let us help you to my office." Jonathan's mask slipped for just a fraction of a second, revealing the cold anger beneath. "My wife is fine. We have an appointment to keep." "The appointment can wait," Max said firmly, moving to stand beside Elena. His military bearing was unmistakable now, the way he held himself speaking to years of command and combat experience. "Ma'am, no one leaves this building until we're certain you're okay." For a moment, the tableau held. Jonathan faced off against the retired Marine general and the bank manager, while other customers and employees watched with growing awareness that something serious was happening. Becca stood frozen between them, her free hand still protective over her unborn child. Then Elena made the decision for all of them. "Security," she called to the guard by the door. "Please escort Mr. and Mrs. Pemberton to my office. We'll get this sorted out properly." Jonathan's expression darkened, but with so many witnesses and the involvement of bank staff, he had little choice but to comply. As they moved toward Elena's office, Mac caught Becca's eye again. This time, she didn't shake her head. Instead, she mouthed a single word that chilled his blood. "Help!" In Elena's office, Becca sat in the leather chair across from the desk, while Jonathan stood behind her like a sentinel. Elena offered water and asked gentle questions about how Becca was feeling, but Jonathan answered each one, his hand resting possessively on his wife's shoulder. Mac knocked and entered without waiting for permission. "I thought you might need medical attention," he said to Becca directly. I have paramedic training. That's not necessary, Jonathan said quickly. Rebecca has excellent private health care. We'll see her doctor if needed. When was the last time you saw your doctor, Mrs. Matthews? Mac asked, ignoring Jonathan entirely. Becca opened her mouth to speak, but Jonathan's fingers tightened on her shoulder. She saw Dr. Harrison last week. Everything was fine. Mac noticed Becca wince at the pressure. I wasn't asking you, sir. Mrs. Matthews, when did you last see your doctor? The question hung in the air. Elena watched carefully as Becca struggled with how to answer. Jonathan's presence loomed over her, but something about Mac's steady, patient demeanor seemed to give her strength. I haven't seen Dr. Harrison in 3 weeks, she whispered. Jonathan said we couldn't afford the appointments anymore. Mac's eyebrows rose. The man standing before him was clearly wealthy, from his expensive suit to his designer watch. Can't afford medical care. There have been some business complications, Jonathan said smoothly. Nothing that concerns anyone here. Everything concerning my niece concerns me, Max said quietly. The word hit the room like a thunderbolt. Jonathan's face went white, then flushed with anger. Becca's head snapped up, hope flooding her features for the first time since Mac had seen her in the bank. Uncle Mac? She breathed. Hello, sweetheart, he said gently. It's been too long. Jonathan's carefully constructed facade cracked completely. You have no right to interfere in our marriage. Rebecca, we're leaving. Now. But Mac stepped between them and the door. 30 years of military service had taught him how to read situations, and everything about this one screamed danger. His niece was pregnant, isolated, and clearly afraid of her own husband. The millionaire husband who claimed he couldn't afford medical care while wearing a watch that cost more than most people made in a year. Actually, Elena said firmly, I think we need to involve our security team, and perhaps the police. The police? Jonathan laughed, but there was no humor in it. For what? Helping my pregnant wife when she felt faint? Mac's expression hardened. I saw you grab her arm hard enough to leave marks. I saw her fall, and I saw the look in her eyes when she asked for help. You saw what you wanted to see, Jonathan shot back. Rebecca, tell them. Tell them you're fine and want to go home. All eyes turned to Becca. She sat small and still in the leather chair, her hands folded protectively over her pregnant belly. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. I want to go home, she whispered, but not with him. The admission seemed to drain all the fight out of her. She slumped forward, tears streaming down her face as months of fear and isolation finally found their voice. I can't do this anymore. I can't pretend everything's fine when it's not. When I'm scared all the time, when I'm worried about what he might do to our baby. Jonathan's face contorted with rage. How dare you? After everything I've given you, everything I've done for you. What exactly have you done for her? Mac demanded, stepping closer. His voice carried the quiet authority of someone used to command. Besides isolate her from her family and control every aspect of her life, I've provided for her, given her a life most women would kill for, a life where she can't afford prenatal care, where she's afraid to speak in public, where she falls down in banks and makes excuses for bruises. Elena was already reaching for her phone. I'm calling 911. We need paramedics to check on Mrs. Matthews and her baby, and we need police to document what happened here. You'll regret this, Jonathan snarled at Mac. I have lawyers, connections, money. I can make your life very difficult. Mac smiled grimly. Son, I've been shot at by terrorists, bombed by insurgents, and threatened by dictators. A millionaire with anger management problems doesn't particularly worry me. As Elena spoke to the emergency dispatcher, Mac knelt beside his niece's chair. Becca, I need you to listen to me carefully. You and the baby are going to be safe. I promise you that. But I need to know how long this has been going on. Through her tears, Becca began to tell him. The story came out in whispers and broken sentences, painting a picture of escalating control and abuse that had started slowly after their wedding and grown worse with each passing month. Jonathan's initial charm had gradually given way to criticism, then isolation from friends and family, then control over her finances and activities. The physical violence had started just a few weeks ago, always followed by apologies and promises to change. He said if I told anyone, he'd make sure I lost everything, she whispered. The house, the money, even the baby. He said he had lawyers who could prove I was an unfit mother. Mac's jaw tightened. Becca, look at me. That's not how the law works. No judge is going to take a baby from its mother because she reported domestic violence. But he has so much money, so many connections. And I have 30 years of experience dealing with bullies who think power makes them untouchable, Mac replied firmly. Money doesn't trump justice. Not on my watch. The paramedics arrived first, followed closely by two police officers. As the EMTs checked Becca's vital signs and the baby's heartbeat, Detective Ray Morrison took statements from everyone present. Mac was relieved to see Morrison, a former military police officer who understood both the dynamics of domestic violence and the importance of proper documentation. Jonathan's demeanor shifted again as he spoke to the detective, becoming the smooth, reasonable businessman once more. He explained that his wife was having a difficult pregnancy, that she'd been emotional and unstable lately, that today's incident was simply a misunderstanding, blown out of proportion by well-meaning strangers. But Detective Morrison had seen it all before. He photographed the finger-shaped bruises on Becca's arm, documented her statement about the fall and Jonathan's behavior, and noted the stark contrast between Jonathan's expensive appearance and his claims about not being able to afford medical care. Mr. Pemberton, Morrison said finally, I'm going to need you to stay away from your wife for the next 24 hours. She needs medical attention and time to rest without stress. You can't do that, Jonathan protested. She's my wife. We live together. I can and I am. It's called a cooling off period, and it's standard procedure in domestic disturbance calls. Mrs. Matthews will be staying elsewhere tonight. Max stepped forward. She'll be staying with family, where she belongs. As the paramedics prepared to transport Becca to the hospital for a full evaluation, she reached for Mac's hand. I'm scared, she whispered. I know, sweetheart, but you're not alone anymore. Your grandmother Grace always said this family takes care of its own. That hasn't changed. Jonathan's parting words as the police escorted him from the bank were delivered with cold precision. This isn't over. Not by a long shot. Mac watched him go, then turned back to his niece. Becca looked fragile and frightened, but there was something new in her eyes now, something that looked like hope. Uncle Mac, she said softly as they prepared to leave for the hospital, thank you for seeing me, for really seeing me. Mac squeezed her hand gently. That's what family does, Becca. We see each other, we protect each other, and we never ever give up on each other. As they left the bank, Mac's mind was already working through the challenge ahead. His niece was in danger from a powerful, wealthy man who clearly believed his money made him untouchable. But Jonathan Pemberton had just made a critical error in judgment. He'd threatened a Marine's family, and Mac hadn't spent 30 years in the Corps learning to back down from bullies, no matter how much money they had. The real fight was just beginning. The emergency room at Memorial Hospital buzzed with typical evening activity, but in Examination Room 3, an unusual family reunion was taking place. Mac sat beside the hospital bed where Becca rested, monitoring equipment tracking both her vital signs and the baby's heartbeat. Dr. Patricia Henley, a veteran emergency physician who had seen far too many cases like this one, finished reviewing the test results. The good news is that both you and the baby appear to be physically fine, Dr. Henley said gently to Becca. Your blood pressure is elevated, which is concerning given your pregnancy, but that's likely due to stress. The bruising on your arm is consistent with someone gripping you forcefully, but there doesn't appear to be any serious tissue damage. Becca nodded, still seeming dazed by the day's events. The baby's really okay. Strong heartbeat, normal movement patterns. But I am concerned about your overall well-being. Stress during pregnancy can have serious consequences for both mother and child. Mac leaned forward. Doctor, what do we need to know about keeping them both safe? Doctor. Henley closed the chart and sat down, her expression serious. Mr. Sullivan, domestic violence typically escalates during pregnancy. The incidents become more frequent and more severe. Today's public confrontations suggest we're dealing with someone who's losing control of the situation. What does that mean for Becca? It means she's in more danger now than she was yesterday. The abuser's mask has slipped in public. He's been exposed, and that often leads to desperate attempts to regain control. The words hung heavy in the room. Becca closed her eyes, one hand resting on her belly. I should have stayed quiet. Should have just gone home with him. No, Max said firmly. You did exactly the right thing. The dangerous thing would have been to continue pretending everything was fine. Dr. Henley nodded. Mrs. Matthews, I've been treating domestic violence cases for 20 years. Silence never makes it better. It only gives the abuser more time to escalate. Soft knock interrupted them. Elena Rodriguez peered around the door. I hope it's okay that I came. I wanted to make sure you were all right. Of course, Max said, standing to offer her a chair. Elena, this is my niece, Rebecca Matthews. Becca, Elena is the bank manager who helped us today. Elena took Becca's hand gently. How are you feeling, dear? Confused, Becca admitted. This morning I was living one life, and now everything's different. I don't even know where I'm going to sleep tonight. Mac and Elena exchanged glances. It was Elena who spoke first. I might be able to help with that. I know this situation better than you might think. She rolled up her sleeve, revealing a faded scar that ran from her wrist to her elbow. My ex-husband gave me this with a broken beer bottle, told me if I ever left him, he'd finish the job. Becca's eyes widened. Elena continued quietly. That was 8 years ago. It took me 3 attempts to finally get away from him, and I only managed it because people like your uncle helped me see that I deserved better. What happened to him? Becca asked. Prison eventually, but only after he violated multiple restraining orders and escalated to stalking and property destruction. Men like that don't just accept losing control. Mac's expression darkened. Are you saying Jonathan won't let this go? Elena nodded grimly. Men with money and power are often worse than regular abusers. They have resources to make victims' lives miserable in ways that don't leave physical evidence. Legal harassment, financial manipulation, social isolation through their networks. Dr. Henley interjected, which is why we need to be very strategic about the next steps. Mrs. Matthews, do you have somewhere safe to stay? Somewhere he can't find you or pressure you to return? Becca shook her head. All our friends are his friends. Our house, our cars, everything is in his name. I don't even have access to our bank accounts anymore. He said it was for tax purposes, but now I realize he was isolating you financially, Mac finished. Classic control tactic. I have a house, Elena offered suddenly. Well, a rental property that's empty right now. It's in my maiden name, completely disconnected from the bank or anything your husband would know about. You could stay there while we figure out longer-term solutions. Max studied Elena carefully. Why would you do that for someone you just met? Elena's smile was sad but determined. Because 8 years ago, a stranger offered me the same thing. A prosecutor named Catherine Walsh, who was handling my ex-husband's case. She let me stay in her guest house for 2 months while I got back on my feet. She said women helping women was the only way to break the cycle. Judge Walsh? Mac asked, recognition dawning. Family court judge Catherine Walsh? You know her? Mac nodded slowly. She handled the custody case for one of my Marines whose ex-wife was trying to use their kids as weapons. Judge Walsh was the one who saw through the manipulation and protected those children. She's good people. Dr. Henley was writing notes in Becca's chart. I'm going to recommend that you stay somewhere secure for at least the next week. Your blood pressure needs monitoring, and you need stress reduction for the baby's sake. I'm also going to prescribe some prenatal vitamins and schedule you with our obstetrics department for a full evaluation. I can't afford all that, Becca whispered. Jonathan controls all our money, and I don't have health insurance in my own name. Don't worry about that right now, Max said firmly. We'll figure out the financial details later. Elena leaned forward. Actually, there might be a way to address the insurance issue. Banks have victim assistance programs for customers affected by domestic violence. It includes temporary health coverage and legal aid referrals. Mac raised an eyebrow. Is that standard for all banks? No, Elena admitted, but I implemented it at our branch after my own experience. The corporate office approved it as a community outreach program. As the evening wore on, the 3 adults worked together to create a safety plan for Becca. Elena would drive her to the rental house, which was located in a quiet neighborhood 20 minutes from the city center. Mac would follow to help her get settled and ensure the location was secure. Dr. Henley provided emergency contact information and scheduled a follow-up appointment for the next week. But as they prepared to leave the hospital, Becca suddenly gripped Mac's arm. I need to tell you something else. Something I haven't told anyone. Mac sat back down. What is it, sweetheart? This isn't the first time Jonathan's been physical. The fall at the bank, that was the third time he's pushed me this month. And there have been other incidents. Grabbing, shaking, blocking doorways so I can't leave rooms. He's careful not to leave marks where people would see them. Elena and Mac exchanged grim looks. Dr. Henley returned to the bedside. Mrs. Matthews, I need to document this properly. Can you tell me about the other incidents? Through tears, Becca described a pattern of escalating abuse that had begun shortly after their first wedding anniversary. Jonathan's behavior had grown progressively worse, but he was clever about it. The physical incidents always happened in private, always followed by apologies and expensive gifts. He'd convinced her that it was her fault, that she was too sensitive, that she needed to be more understanding of the pressure he was under with his business. He made me feel like I was crazy, she whispered. Like I was imagining things or making them worse than they were. That's called gaslighting, Elena said gently. It's a form of psychological abuse designed to make you question your own reality. Mac felt anger burning in his chest, but he kept his voice calm and steady. Becca, none of this is your fault, and you're not crazy. You're the victim of a carefully planned campaign of abuse. Dr. Henley finished her notes. I'm required by law to report this to the authorities as suspected domestic violence. Detective Morrison will receive a copy of my findings, which will support any legal action you decide to pursue. As they finally prepared to leave, Becca asked quietly, Uncle Mac, why didn't I see you at family gatherings? Grandma Grace always asks about you. Mac's expression grew troubled. Becca, I need to be honest with you. I stopped coming to family events because of Jonathan. What do you mean? The first time I met him, about 6 months after your wedding, something felt off. He was charming, polite, said all the right things. But there were little signs. The way he spoke for you, the way he steered conversations away from your opinions, the way he positioned himself physically to control your movements. Becca stared at him. Why didn't you say anything? I tried gently. I asked you privately if you were happy, if everything was okay. But you defended him, insisted everything was perfect, and he was smart about it. He never did anything obvious in front of family. So you stayed away? Mac nodded regretfully. I thought my presence was making things worse for you. Jonathan made it clear that he saw me as a threat, and I was worried that confronting him would result in him isolating you from the family completely. Elena touched Mac's shoulder. That's exactly what abusers count on. They make everyone around the victim feel like intervention will make things worse. I should have fought harder, Mac said quietly. Should have found a way to stay connected. Becca reached for his hand. Uncle Mac, you couldn't have known. And you were there when I needed you most. That's what matters. As they left the hospital together, Mac felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. His niece was carrying his great-niece or great-nephew, and both were in danger from a wealthy, powerful man who had proven he was willing to use violence to maintain control. But Jonathan Pemberton had made a critical miscalculation. He'd targeted a Marine's family, and Mac hadn't spent 30 years learning military tactics to let them sit unused when the people he loved were threatened. The drive to Elena's rental house was quiet, each of them lost in their own thoughts. But as they pulled into the driveway of a modest 2-bedroom home in a tree-lined neighborhood, Mac felt something he hadn't experienced since retiring from active duty. He felt like he had a mission again. The rental house Elena provided was small but comfortable, tucked into a quiet residential neighborhood where mature oak trees lined the streets and front porches held flower pots and rocking chairs. As Mac helped Becca settle into the main bedroom, she seemed to relax for the first time all day. It feels safe here, she said, running her hand along the quilt covering the double bed. I haven't felt safe in my own home for months. Mac checked the locks on all the windows and doors, noting with approval that Elena had chosen well. The house sat on a corner lot with good sight lines in all directions, solid locks, and a security system that was already activated. Elena knows what she's doing. This place is secure. Elena emerged from the kitchen carrying a cup of chamomile tea. I stocked the refrigerator with basics and left my contact information on the counter. The house phone is connected, and there's a medical alert button by the bed that goes directly to emergency services. Becca accepted the tea gratefully. I can't believe you're doing all this for someone you just met. I told you before, someone did the same for me. Judge Walsh didn't just help me find a safe place to stay. She connected me with resources I didn't even know existed. Max sat down in the chair across from the bed. Speaking of resources, I think it's time we started building a proper support network. Becca, you're not going to face this alone. Over the next hour, Mac explained his plan. As a retired Marine general, he had contacts throughout the military, law enforcement, and judicial systems. More importantly, he had maintained relationships with people who specialized in exactly this type of situation. Detective Morrison is just the beginning, Mac said. I want you to meet with Dr. Sarah Chen, a psychiatrist who works with abuse survivors. She can help document the psychological impact of what Jonathan's done to you, which is important for legal proceedings. Elena nodded approvingly. Documentation is crucial. Abusers are often very good at appearing normal in public, so you need professionals who know how to identify and record the real impact. I'm also going to contact Judge Walsh, Matt continued. If Jonathan tries to use the legal system to harass you, we need someone who understands the dynamics of domestic violence cases. Becca set down her teacup with shaking hands. This all sounds so official, so permanent. What if I'm wrong? What if I'm overreacting? Mac's expression grew serious. Becca, look at me. You're 6 months pregnant, and your husband pushed you down in public. You have bruises from where he grabbed you, and you just told us about months of escalating abuse. You're not overreacting. You're finally reacting appropriately. Elena sat on the edge of the bed. I know it's overwhelming. When I first left my ex-husband, I kept thinking I should go back, that maybe I was making things worse. But the fear you feel about his reaction, that's your instincts telling you the truth about how dangerous he really is? Max stood and began pacing, his military mind already working through contingencies. Tomorrow I'm going to make some calls. I want to know everything about Jonathan Pemberton's business dealings, his legal history, his financial situation. Men like him usually have vulnerabilities they try to hide. What kind of vulnerabilities? Becca asked. Financial irregularities? Tax issues? Business partners with complaints? Previous legal troubles that were settled quietly? Wealthy abusers often use their money to make problems disappear, but that creates a paper trail. Elena looked intrigued. You think he's done this before? Mac nodded grimly. Abusers rarely start with their current victim. There are usually ex-girlfriends, former employees, business associates who have stories to tell. We just need to find them and give them a safe way to speak up. As if summoned by their conversation, Mac's phone rang. The caller ID showed Detective Morrison's number. Mac, I've got some information you need to hear, Morrison said without preamble when Mac answered. Can you talk privately? Mac stepped outside onto the front porch. What did you find? Jonathan Pemberton has been on our radar before. 3 years ago, his ex-wife filed a domestic violence complaint, but dropped it the next week. 2 years ago, a former employee filed a workplace harassment complaint, but settled out of court with an NDA. Last year, there was a neighbor complaint about loud arguments and what sounded like someone being physically assaulted, but no one would make an official statement. Mac's jaw tightened. So he has a pattern. A clear pattern, but he's smart about it. Good lawyers, quick settlements, NDAs, and enough money to make problems go away before they become public record. What about the ex-wife? Amanda Brooks Pemberton reverted to her maiden name after the divorce. She's a lawyer now, works for a nonprofit that helps domestic violence victims. I'm guessing she found her calling after her own experience. Mac felt a spark of hope. Think she'd be willing to talk to Becca? I already reached out. She wants to meet with both of you tomorrow. Says she's been waiting 3 years for someone to ask the right questions about Jonathan Pemberton. After Mac hung up and returned to the house, he shared Morrison's findings with Becca and Elena. Becca's reaction was a mixture of relief and fear. I'm not the only one, she whispered. I'm not crazy, and I'm not the first. Elena squeezed her hand. That's both good news and bad news. Good because it proves you're not imagining things. Bad because it means Jonathan is very experienced at this. Max sat back down, his expression thoughtful. Actually, I think it's all good news. Experience makes people confident, and confidence makes them careless. He's probably using the same playbook he used on his ex-wife, which means we can predict his moves. They spent the next hour discussing practical safety measures. Mac would drive Becca to all appointments and meetings until they had a better sense of Jonathan's response to the day's events. Elena would coordinate with the bank's victim assistance program to help with immediate financial needs. They established a check-in schedule so that someone would know where Becca was at all times. As the evening grew late, Elena prepared to leave. "I'll pick you up at 10 tomorrow morning for your doctor's appointment. Mac will meet us there." After Elena left, Mac helped Becca review the security features of the house one more time. The medical alert button, the security system, the predetermined escape routes if needed. It felt surreal, planning for danger while surrounded by the cozy domesticity of floral curtains and family photos left by the previous tenant. "Uncle Mac," Becca said as she prepared for bed, "what if he finds me here? What if he gets angry and does something worse?" Mac met her eyes steadily. "Becca, I want you to understand something about bullies. They prey on people who they think are alone and defenseless. Jonathan has been operating under the assumption that you had no one to turn to, no one who would fight for you. But now I do. Now you have me. You have Elena, Detective Morrison, Dr. Henley, and tomorrow you'll meet Amanda and Judge Walsh. That's not just a support network, sweetheart. That's a battle formation." Becca managed a small smile. "You make it sound like a military operation." Mac's expression grew serious. "In a way it is. Jonathan has been waging a campaign against you for months, using psychological warfare to break down your defenses and isolate you from reinforcements. But now the tables have turned. Now we're the ones with superior intelligence, better resources, and stronger alliances. What happens next? Next we go on the offensive, but carefully, strategically, and with overwhelming force. Jonathan Pemberton thinks his money makes him untouchable. He's about to learn that there are some things money can't buy." As Mac prepared to leave for his own home, Becca caught his sleeve. "Thank you for believing me, for seeing what was really happening." Mac squeezed her hand gently. "That's what family does, Becca. We see each other, we protect each other, and we never give up. Your grandmother taught me that, and now I'm teaching it to you." After Mac left, Becca lay in the unfamiliar bed, one hand resting on her growing belly. For the first time in months, she felt something that had been absent from her life for so long, she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. Hope. Outside, Mac sat in his truck for several minutes before starting the engine. He pulled out his phone and began scrolling through his contacts. Tomorrow would bring meetings with Amanda Brooks Pemberton and Judge Walsh. But tonight he had calls to make to old friends in the military justice system, former colleagues who specialized in investigations, and retired Marines who understood that some battles were worth fighting regardless of the odds. Jonathan Pemberton had money, connections, and a history of making his problems disappear, but he'd never faced a Marine general whose family was under threat. The law office of Amanda Brooks Pemberton occupied the ground floor of a restored Victorian house in the historic district, its cheerful yellow exterior and flower boxes presenting a stark contrast to the serious work conducted inside. Mac and Becca arrived precisely at 9 a.m., having spent the morning reviewing safety protocols and discussing what questions to ask Jonathan's ex-wife. Amanda met them at the door herself, a petite woman in her mid-30s with auburn hair and intelligent green eyes. She wore a professional Navy suit, but Mac noticed the way she positioned herself to maintain clear sight lines to all exits. The same hypervigilance he'd observed in combat veterans. "Mrs. Matthews, General Sullivan, please come in. I've cleared my morning schedule so we can talk without interruption." Her office was warm and welcoming, with soft lighting and comfortable chairs arranged in a conversation area, rather than the intimidating desk setup typical of most law offices. On the walls hung certificates and awards from domestic violence organizations, along with photos of women and children Amanda had helped over the years. "Before we begin," Amanda said as they settled into chairs, "I want you to know that everything we discuss is protected by attorney-client privilege. Even though you're not officially my client, you can speak freely without worrying about anything being used against you later." Becca nodded nervously. "Detective Morrison said you were married to Jonathan before me." Amanda's expression grew serious. "For 3 years. The marriage ended 4 years ago, and I've spent the time since then rebuilding my life and helping other women do the same." Mac leaned forward. "What can you tell us about his patterns, his methods?" Amanda opened a thick file folder on the coffee table between them. Jonathan is extremely sophisticated in his approach to abuse. He studied what works and what doesn't, likely from his previous relationships. He starts with love bombing, overwhelming attention and affection that feels like fairy tale romance. Becca's eyes widened with recognition. The first 6 months were incredible. He made me feel like the most important person in the world. Then comes the isolation phase, Amanda continued. He slowly separates you from friends and family, usually by creating conflicts or scheduling important events that conflict with your social plans. He makes it seem like these are unfortunate coincidences rather than deliberate choices. He always had business dinners on nights when I had plans with friends, Becca whispered, and he'd get upset if I went without him, saying I was putting other people ahead of our relationship. Mac made notes on a legal pad. What about the financial control? Amanda pulled out a document from her file. This is a timeline I created of how Jonathan took control of my finances. It started with romantic gestures like insisting on paying for everything, then suggestions about combining accounts for convenience. Within a year, I had no independent access to money. She handed the document to Mac, who studied it with the tactical eye of someone planning a campaign. He follows the same pattern every time, with minor variations based on the woman's specific vulnerabilities. For me, it was my student loans and career ambitions. He offered to pay off my loans if I'd let him handle our finances, then gradually made it impossible for me to maintain my career by creating conflicts with my work schedule. Becca was crying quietly. He paid off my credit cards after we got married, said it was a wedding present. Then he convinced me to quit teaching because the stress wasn't good for someone trying to get pregnant. Now I realize he was cutting off my financial independence. Amanda handed her tissues. It's not your fault, Becca. These men are extremely skilled manipulators. They study their targets and adapt their approach accordingly. Mac looked up from the timeline. What about the physical violence? When did that start with you? Amanda's face darkened. About 18 months into the marriage. It started with grabbing my arm too hard during arguments, escalating to pushing and shaking. The first time he actually hit me was when I threatened to visit my sister without him. How did it end? Amanda rolled up her sleeve, revealing a faded scar Mac had noticed when she greeted them. He put me in the hospital, told the doctors I'd fallen downstairs, and I was so brainwashed by that point that I backed up his story. Becca gasped. What changed your mind? The doctor treating me was Dr. Patricia Henley. She'd seen cases like mine before, and she didn't believe Jonathan's story. She connected me with resources and helped me understand that what was happening wasn't normal or acceptable. Hala, Max smiled grimly. Dr. Henley treated Becca yesterday. She's the one who insisted on proper documentation of the abuse. Amanda nodded approvingly. Dr. Henley saved my life. She connected me with Judge Catherine Walsh, who helped me navigate the legal system safely. We're meeting with Judge Walsh this afternoon, Max said. What should we expect from Jonathan's response to yesterday's incident? Amanda opened another section of her file. Based on my experience and what I've learned from other victims, he'll follow a predictable escalation pattern. First comes the charm offensive, trying to convince everyone that Becca is emotionally unstable and he's the long-suffering husband trying to help her. He already started that at the bank, Mac observed. Then he'll use his financial resources to apply pressure. Expensive lawyers, private investigators, manipulation of mutual acquaintances to turn them against Becca. He'll paint himself as the victim of a vindictive wife trying to steal his money. Becca looked terrified. Can he really do that? Can he turn people against me? Amanda leaned forward, her expression intense. He can try, and he will try. But here's what he doesn't know. Times have changed since my divorce. There's much more awareness about domestic violence now, better legal protections, and stronger support networks. Max studied the documents Amanda had shared. What about his business dealings? Any vulnerabilities there? Amanda's smile turned predatory. Now that's where things get interesting. Jonathan's real estate empire isn't as solid as he pretends. He's leveraged to the hilt, and several of his recent projects are underwater. He owes significant money to some very unforgiving creditors. Meaning his threats about expensive lawyers and unlimited resources might be more bluff than substance. My contacts in the financial sector say he's been scrambling for cash flow for the past 6 months. Mac felt pieces clicking into place. That explains why he said they couldn't afford Becca's medical care. He's probably having serious financial problems. Amanda nodded, which makes him more dangerous in some ways, but also more vulnerable. Desperate people make mistakes. They spent the next hour reviewing Amanda's detailed documentation of Jonathan's patterns, methods, and weaknesses. She had kept meticulous records during and after their marriage, building a comprehensive profile of his behavior that read like a psychological case study. "I've been waiting for someone else to come forward," Amanda admitted. "I knew he'd remarry quickly and repeat the same patterns. I've been building this file for 3 years, hoping to help his next victim." Becca looked overwhelmed by the information. "There's so much I didn't see, so many things I should have recognized." Amanda reached over and took her hand. "Becca, look at me. You were targeted by an expert predator who spent months or years studying your vulnerabilities and crafting an approach specifically designed to exploit them. The fact that you eventually recognized the danger and asked for help shows incredible strength." Matt closed his notebook. "Amanda, would you be willing to testify about your experiences if this goes to court?" Amanda's expression grew determined. "I've been preparing for that possibility for 3 years. I have documentation, medical records, witness statements, and financial records that prove Jonathan's pattern of abuse. I'll do whatever it takes to make sure he doesn't destroy another woman's life." As they prepared to leave, Amanda handed Becca a business card. "My direct number's on there. Call me anytime, day or night, if you need someone who understands exactly what you're going through." In the parking lot, Mac and Becca sat in his truck processing the information they learned. Becca seemed both relieved and overwhelmed. "She's so strong," Becca said quietly. "She survived Jonathan and turned her experience into a way to help other people." Max started the engine. "That's what survivors do, Becca. They take their pain and turn it into power to protect others. Do you think I'll ever be that strong?" Mac looked at his niece, seeing past the fear and vulnerability to the determination that had brought her this far. "Sweetheart, you already are. You're 6 months pregnant, trapped in an abusive marriage to a wealthy, powerful man, and you still found the courage to ask for help. That's not weakness. That's incredible strength." As they drove toward their appointment with Judge Walsh, Mac's phone rang. Detective Morrison's name appeared on the display. "Mac, we've got a problem," Morrison said without preamble. "Jonathan Pemberton filed a complaint this morning, claiming Becca stole money from their joint account and is trying to extort him. He's also alleging that she's mentally unstable and poses a danger to their unborn child." Mac pulled into a parking lot to focus on the call. "What kind of complaint?" "He went to a different precinct, one where he has connections, and filed reports for theft, fraud, and endangering the welfare of a child. He's demanding that she be arrested and forced to undergo psychiatric evaluation." Becca could hear enough of the conversation to understand what was happening. Her face went white with terror. "He's doing exactly what Amanda said he would do." Mac's expression hardened. "Morrison, what are our options?" "Judge Walsh has been expecting this. She's prepared to issue a protective order that will supersede any complaints filed by Jonathan. But we need to move fast. We're on our way to see her now." After Mac hung up, he turned to Becca. "This is what Amanda warned us about. Jonathan's using the system to try to regain control." Becca was shaking. "What if they believe him? What if they really do think I'm mentally unstable?" Mac reached over and squeezed her hand. "Becca, look at me. We have Dr. Henley's medical report documenting your injuries. We have Detective Morrison's incident report from yesterday. We have Amanda's testimony about Jonathan's patterns. And now we have Judge Walsh, who Amanda says understands these cases better than anyone. But he has money, connections. And we have the truth," Max said firmly. "Amanda survived this and built a new life. You're going to survive this too. But right now, we need to get to Judge Walsh and make sure Jonathan's lies don't get any traction in the legal system." As they drove toward the courthouse, Mac's mind was already working through contingencies. Jonathan's counterattack had begun exactly as Amanda predicted, but they weren't the unprepared victims he expected to face. This time, he was facing opponents who knew his playbook. Judge Catherine Walsh's chambers reflected 30 years of legal experience and a deep understanding of human nature. The walls displayed her law degree alongside photos of the hundreds of families she'd helped through difficult divorces and custody battles. As Mac and Becca entered, the 61-year-old judge rose from behind her desk with the bearing of someone accustomed to making life-changing decisions. General Sullivan, Mrs. Matthews, please sit down. I've been reviewing the materials Detective Morrison sent over, and I understand we have an urgent situation developing. Judge Walsh moved to a conference table where several files were already spread out. Mac noticed she'd arranged the seating so that Becca would have her back to a wall and clear sight lines to the door, the same consideration Amanda had shown in her office. Mrs. Matthews, I want you to understand that what I'm about to tell you may be frightening, but knowledge is power in situations like this. Your husband filed several complaints this morning at the downtown precinct, where he has cultivated relationships with certain officers over the years. Becca's hands trembled as she folded them over her pregnant belly. What kind of complaints? Judge Walsh consulted her notes. Theft of marital funds, fraud related to medical expenses, and endangering the welfare of an unborn child due to alleged mental instability. He's also filed for an emergency protective order claiming you've threatened him. Mac's expression darkened. All lies designed to paint Becca as the aggressor. Sophisticated lies, Judge Walsh corrected. Mr. Pemberton has clearly done this before. The complaints are crafted to exploit common misconceptions about domestic violence and to use the legal system as a weapon against his victim. Becca looked between them desperately. Can he really have me arrested? Can he take my baby? Judge Walsh leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. Mrs. Matthews, I need you to listen carefully. These are scare tactics designed to force you to return to him voluntarily rather than face legal consequences. It's a form of legal abuse, and I've seen it many times before. She opened one of the files. However, Mr. Pemberton made several critical errors in his filings. First, he claimed you withdrew money from accounts without authorization, but bank records show you've had no independent access to any accounts for over 8 months. Second, he claimed you've been erratic and violent, but there are no police reports, medical records, or witness statements supporting these claims. Mac nodded approvingly. Meanwhile, we have extensive documentation of his abuse. Exactly. Dr. Henley's medical report, Detective Morrison's incident report, photographs of your injuries, and witness statements from bank employees all contradict Mr. Pemberton's version of events. Judge Walsh stood and moved to her desk, returning with a document. I'm issuing an emergency protective order that will prevent Mr. Pemberton from contacting you directly or indirectly, coming within 500 feet of your current residence, or accessing any shared assets until we can hold a full hearing. Becca's eyes widened. You can do that? I can and I am. The protective order supersedes any complaints he filed and ensures your safety while we sort through the legal complexities. Max studied the document. What about his allegations of theft and fraud? I've already spoken with the district attorney's office. Given the clear evidence of domestic violence and the suspicious timing of Mr. Pemberton's complaints, they're treating his allegations as potential legal harassment rather than legitimate criminal matters. Judge Walsh returned to her seat. Mrs. Matthews, I need you to understand that this is likely to get worse before it gets better. Men like your husband don't accept losing control easily, especially when they have resources to fight back. As if summoned by her words, Mac's phone began ringing. The caller ID showed an unknown number. Don't answer it, Judge Walsh advised. All communication should go through legal channels now. The phone stopped ringing, then immediately started again. Then Becca's phone began buzzing with text messages. Judge Walsh nodded grimly. It's starting. He's going to try to overwhelm you with contact attempts, making each one seem innocent, while the cumulative effect is harassment. Mac powered off both phones. What's our next step? We document everything. Every phone call, every text message, every attempt at contact becomes evidence of violation of the protective order. Judge Walsh opened another file. I've also been in contact with Amanda Brooks Pemberton. She's provided extensive documentation of Mr. Pemberton's patterns from their marriage. Combined with the current evidence, we have a strong case for extending the protective order and pursuing criminal charges. Over the next hour, Judge Walsh explained the legal process ahead. There would be a hearing within 10 days where Jonathan could contest the protective order. Until then, he was legally prohibited from any contact with Becca or attempts to access their shared resources. Judge Walsh, Becca asked quietly, what if he doesn't follow the order? What if he comes to the house where I'm staying? Then he'll be arrested immediately. Violation of a protective order is a criminal offense, especially when it involves a pregnant woman. Mac leaned forward. Leaned. Judge, based on your experience, what should we expect from Jonathan's legal team? Judge Walsh's expression grew serious. They'll try to paint Mrs. Matthews as an unstable gold digger who married Mr. Pemberton for his money and is now trying to extort him through false abuse allegations. They'll claim the pregnancy was planned to trap him financially. Becca gasped. That's not true. I loved him. I thought he loved me. I know, dear. But they'll use Mr. Pemberton's wealth and social standing to suggest that someone like him would never need to abuse anyone because he could have any woman he wanted. Mac's jaw tightened. Classic victim-blaming tactics. Unfortunately, yes. They'll also try to exclude evidence from his previous marriage, claiming it's irrelevant to the current case. That's where Amanda's documentation becomes crucial. As they prepared to leave, Judge Walsh handed Becca a folder containing copies of all the legal documents. Mrs. Matthews, I want you to remember that the legal system can be intimidating, but you're not facing it alone. You have advocates who understand exactly what you're going through. In the courthouse parking lot, Mac and Becca sat in his truck reviewing the protective order. The legal language was complex, but the essential message was clear. Jonathan was now legally prohibited from contacting or approaching Becca. I can't believe it's real, Becca said, staring at the document. For the first time in months, I have legal protection from him. Max started the engine. It's real, but it's also just the beginning. Jonathan's not going to accept this quietly. As if to prove his point, Mac's phone immediately began ringing again when he turned it back on. This time, the caller ID showed Jonathan's name directly. He's already violating the order, Mac observed, letting the call go to voicemail. Becca's phone also lit up with messages. He's texting me constantly, saying he loves me, that this is all a misunderstanding, that I'm hurting our baby by keeping us apart. Mac drove toward Elena's rental house, his mind working through the implications. Save all of those messages, but don't respond. Every contact attempt is evidence of violation. As they turned onto the quiet residential street where Becca was staying, Mac noticed an expensive black sedan parked across from the house. Becca, don't look, but there's a car that doesn't belong in this neighborhood. Becca stiffened. Do you think it's Jonathan? More likely a private investigator. Amanda warned us he'd use surveillance to try to build a case against you. Mac parked in the driveway and walked around to help Becca from the truck, making sure to position himself between her and the sedan. As they approached the front door, the sedan's engine started and it drove slowly away. Inside the house, they found Elena waiting with a concerned expression. I've been getting calls all morning from people asking about you, Becca. Someone's been spreading stories that you've had a nervous breakdown and are making false accusations against your husband. Mac nodded grimly. Jonathan's using his social network to control the narrative. Classic abuser tactic. Elena's eyes flashed with anger. Several of my co-workers at the bank received calls from someone claiming to be conducting a background check on bank employees who might have been involved in filing false reports. He's trying to intimidate witnesses, Mac realized. That's another violation we can document. As the afternoon wore on, the harassment campaign intensified. Phone calls to family members claiming Becca was mentally unstable. Social media posts suggesting she was a gold digger trying to extort money from her successful husband. Flowers delivered to the rental house with cards begging her to come home. Each contact attempt violated the protective order, but the cumulative effect was psychological warfare designed to break down Becca's resolve and force her to return to Jonathan voluntarily. This is exactly what happened to me. Amanda's voice came through the speakerphone when Mac called for advice. He's trying to isolate you by making everyone think you're lying about the abuse. Becca was crying again. What if people believe him? What if everyone thinks I'm making this up for money? Elena sat beside her on the couch. Becca, look at me. The people who matter, the people who really know you, they're going to see through his lies. Mac was documenting each violation in a notebook. By my count, he's already violated the protective order at least 15 times today. Judge Walsh said this would happen, but she also said it would work in our favor. As evening approached, Mac prepared to leave for his own home, but hesitated at the door. The black sedan had returned and was parked in the same spot as before. I don't like leaving you here with surveillance outside, he told Elena and Becca. Elena's expression was determined. Then don't leave. The couch pulls out into a bed, and I think we'd all sleep better with you here tonight. Mac nodded, recognizing the wisdom in staying together. Outside, the psychological warfare continued with more flowers, more phone calls, and more attempts to paint Becca as an unstable woman, making false accusations against her loving husband. But inside Elena's rental house, three people who understood exactly what they were facing prepared for the long fight ahead. Jonathan Pemberton had money, connections, and a proven track record of destroying women who tried to leave him. What he didn't have was the truth, and what he didn't understand was that he was no longer facing an isolated, frightened woman with nowhere to turn. He was facing a support network that included a Marine general who had spent 30 years learning how to defeat enemies who thought they were untouchable. The next morning brought an unexpected visitor to the rental house. Grace Sullivan, Mac's 76-year-old mother, stood on the front porch holding a casserole dish and wearing the determined expression that had made her a formidable force in their family for decades. Her silver hair was perfectly styled, and despite her age, she moved with the purposeful energy of someone who had never backed down from a fight. "Grandma Grace?" Becca opened the door in amazement. "What are you doing here?" Grace's weathered hands cupped Becca's face gently. "Did you think I wouldn't come when my great-grandbaby and great-grandmama needed me? Mac called me last night and told me what's been happening." Mac emerged from the kitchen where he'd been reviewing legal documents with Elena. "Mom, I told you I'd come get you later today." "Oh." Grace waved dismissively at her son. "Marcus James Sullivan, I've been taking care of myself longer than you've been alive. I took 3 buses and a taxi to get here because some fights are too important to wait for convenient transportation." Elena helped Grace with her coat and the casserole dish. "Mrs. Sullivan, it's wonderful to meet you. I'm Elena Rodriguez." Grace studied Elena with sharp, intelligent eyes. "You're the bank manager who helped my granddaughter. Mac told me about your kindness." "I just did what anyone should do." Grace's smile was knowing. "Dear, in my experience, very few people do what they should do when it matters most. Thank you for being one of the exceptions." As they settled in the living room, Grace's presence seemed to change the entire atmosphere of the house. Her calm strength and obvious love for Becca provided a stability that had been missing since the crisis began. "Now then," Grace said, taking Becca's hands in hers, "I want you to tell me everything, and I mean everything, starting from the beginning." Over the next hour, Becca told her story again, this time to someone who had known and loved her since birth. Grace listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or squeezing Becca's hands, her expression growing more serious as the details emerged. "Grandma Grace," Becca concluded, "I feel so stupid for not seeing it sooner, for letting it get this bad." Grace's voice carried the authority of 7 decades of life experience. "Rebecca Ann, you listen to me carefully. There is nothing stupid about being targeted by a predator who spent months studying your weaknesses and carefully crafting an approach designed to exploit your natural capacity for love and trust." Mac looked surprised. "Mom, that's exactly what Amanda told us yesterday." Grace's expression grew distant, because some lessons are learned the hard way and passed down through generations of women who survived what should have killed them. Elena leaned forward. "Mrs. Sullivan, it sounds like you're speaking from experience." Grace was quiet for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "Before I married Mac's father, I was married to another man, Thomas Mitchell. Handsome, charming, came from a good family. Everyone thought I was the luckiest girl in town." Becca's eyes widened. "You were married before Grandpa Frank?" "For 2 years. 2 years of walking on eggshells, making excuses for bruises, and believing it was my fault when he lost his temper." Grace's voice was steady but carried the weight of old pain. "This was 1968, remember? There were no shelters, no support groups, no legal protections. A woman who left her husband was considered a failure." Max stared at his mother. "I never knew any of this." Grace smiled sadly at her son. "There were many things your generation didn't need to know. But this girl needs to know she comes from a line of survivors." Elena was taking notes, her own experience with abuse making her understand the significance of what Grace was sharing. "How did you get away from him?" "Thomas made a critical mistake. He decided that intimidating me wasn't enough anymore. He wanted to control my entire family, including my younger sister Margaret. When he threatened her, something in me changed. Grace stood and moved to the window, looking out at the quiet street. I realized that I could accept being hurt, but I couldn't accept him hurting anyone else I loved. That's when I found my strength. Becca was crying quietly. What did you do? I planned, carefully, secretly, for months. I saved money from the household account, 25 cents at a time. I contacted my cousin in another state who offered me a place to stay. I documented his violence in a diary that I hid at my sister's house. Mac's voice was filled with respect. You built a case against him. Grace nodded. When I finally left, it wasn't in panic or desperation. It was a strategic withdrawal executed with military precision. I had evidence, resources, and a plan. Thomas never saw it coming because he'd underestimated the woman he thought he'd broken. She returned to sit beside Becca. 6 months later, I met your grandfather Frank at a church social. He was the kindest, gentlest man I'd ever known. When I told him about Thomas, he said something I'll never forget. What? Becca whispered. Grace's voice grew warm with memory. He said, Grace, surviving that took incredible strength. Now let me spend the rest of my life making sure you never have to be that strong again. Elena wiped away tears. That's beautiful. Frank kept that promise for 47 years until the day he died. But the strength I found when I left Thomas, that never went away. It just found new purposes. Mac looked at his mother with new understanding. Is that why you always insisted that family comes first? Why you taught us to protect each other? Grace nodded. Because I know what happens to people who have nowhere to turn. I know what it feels like to face danger alone. No member of this family will ever face that if I have anything to say about it. She reached into her purse and pulled out a thick manila envelope. Which brings me to the real reason I came here today. Mac frowned. What's that? Grace's smile turned predatory. Information about Jonathan Pemberton that I've been gathering for the past 6 months. The room fell silent. Elena was the first to speak. 6 months? But how did you know? Because I'm not as old and foolish as people think. When Becca stopped coming to family gatherings, when she made excuses every time I called, when her voice changed and she sounded like she was walking on eggshells, I recognized the signs. Max stared at his mother in amazement. You've been investigating Jonathan? Grace opened the envelope and spread documents across the coffee table. I may be 76 years old, but I still have friends in this town. Friends who work at banks, insurance companies, law offices, and government agencies. Friends who remember favors I did for them over the decades. The documents were extensive. Financial records showing Jonathan's business troubles, legal documents from his first marriage, complaints from former employees, and medical records from his ex-wife's hospital visits. Grandma Grace, Becca breathed, how did you get all this? Dear, when you've lived as long as I have and helped as many people as I have, you learn that information is just another form of currency. And I've been very good at investing in relationships over the years. Elena studied the financial documents. These show he's been hiding assets and manipulating his business accounts to avoid paying proper support to his ex-wife. Mac examined legal papers. And these complaints from former employees paint a picture of workplace harassment and intimidation. Grace nodded with satisfaction. Jonathan Pemberton thinks he's very clever, using his money and connections to make problems disappear. But he's never dealt with a network of older women who've learned to protect each other. She pointed to one particular document. That's a psychological evaluation from his first divorce proceedings. The court-appointed psychologist identified clear patterns of narcissistic abuse and recommended supervised visitation with any future children. Becca's hands shook as she read the evaluation. He's done this before. Everything he did to me, he did to Amanda too. And he'll do it to the next woman if we don't stop him now, Grace said firmly. But this time is different because this time he's not facing an isolated victim. He's facing our entire family. Mac gathered the documents carefully. Mom, this is incredible. Judge Walsh and Detective Morrison need to see all of this. Grace's expression grew serious. They will. But first, I want Becca to understand something important. She took her granddaughter's hands again. Sweetheart, you didn't fail at marriage. You didn't make poor choices. You were targeted by a predator who has spent years perfecting his methods. The fact that you survived and asked for help shows incredible courage. But I stayed so long. I made excuses for him. Grace's voice was gentle but firm. I stayed with Thomas for 2 years, making the same excuses, believing the same lies. That doesn't make us weak, Becca. It makes us human. The strength isn't in never falling down. The strength is in getting back up and deciding to fight. Elena was organizing the documents. Mrs. Sullivan, this evidence could be crucial in protecting Becca and preventing Jonathan from hurting anyone else. Grace stood, her posture straight and determined despite her age. That's exactly the plan. Jonathan Pemberton has spent years believing that money and intimidation make him untouchable. He's about to learn that there are some forces in this world that can't be bought or bullied. Mac looked at his mother with profound respect. Mom, why didn't you ever tell us about your first marriage? Grace's smile was sad but wise. Because, my dear son, there's a difference between the stories we tell to inspire and the weapons we keep hidden for when they are needed most. Today, Becca needs both the inspiration and the weapons. As afternoon turned to evening, the four of them worked together to organize Grace's evidence and plan their next moves. Judge Walsh would receive copies of all documents. Detective Morrison would get the financial evidence. Amanda would help them understand how to use the psychological evaluation in legal proceedings. But more than the practical value of the information, Grace's presence had given Becca something she'd been missing for months, the absolute certainty that she belonged to a family that would fight for her no matter what. Grandma Grace, Becca said as they prepared dinner together, do you think I'll ever be as strong as you are? Grace smiled, her weathered hands gentle as she helped Becca chop vegetables. Sweetheart, you already are. You just haven't had the chance to see it yet. Outside, the black sedan had returned to its surveillance position. But inside Elena's rental house, four people who understood exactly what they were facing continued building the case that would finally hold Jonathan Pemberton accountable for decades of abuse. The millionaire thought he was hunting an isolated, frightened woman. He had no idea he was actually facing 3 generations of women who had learned that survival wasn't enough. Sometimes you had to fight back. Detective Morrison arrived at Elena's rental house early the next morning, his expression grim as he reviewed the surveillance footage from his unmarked car. The black sedan had been replaced by a gray SUV, and there had been at least 3 different vehicles monitoring the house throughout the night. Professional surveillance, he confirmed as he spread photos across Elena's kitchen table. Multiple vehicles, rotating shifts, long-range cameras. Jonathan's not just having you watched, he's building a comprehensive intelligence file. Max studied the photos with a tactical eye. These aren't private investigators. This is corporate security-level surveillance. Grace looked up from her morning coffee. How can you tell the difference? Equipment, technique, coordination. Private investigators usually work alone or in pairs. This is a team operation with military-style precision. Elena frowned. Where would Jonathan get access to that level of surveillance? Detective Morrison consulted his notes. That's what I spent yesterday evening finding out. Jonathan's real estate company has contracts with Blackwater Security Solutions, a firm that specializes in corporate espionage and executive protection. Becca felt her blood run cold. He's using his business resources to stalk me? It's worse than that, Morrison continued. Blackwater's client list includes several Fortune 500 companies that have used their services for what they call reputation management during legal disputes. Mac's expression darkened. Reputation management meaning what exactly? Digging up dirt on opposing parties, intimidating witnesses, manipulating media coverage. It's legal corporate espionage dressed up as legitimate business services. Grace set down her coffee cup with a sharp click. So Jonathan's not just fighting this battle himself. He's hired professional reputation destroyers. Morrison nodded. Yesterday afternoon, several of Becca's former teaching colleagues received calls from someone claiming to be a journalist writing a story about teacher misconduct. The caller was fishing for negative information about Becca's performance or personal life. Becca started crying. He's going to destroy my reputation so no one will believe me about the abuse. Elena reached over and squeezed her hand. Only if we let him. But we know what he's doing now, which means we can counter it. Mac was already thinking strategically. Morrison, what legal recourse do we have against this surveillance and harassment campaign? That's where things get interesting. Blackwater's surveillance activities violate several provisions of the protective order. Professional stalking is still stalking, regardless of who's paying for it. Morrison opened his laptop and showed them a series of documents. Judge Walsh issued warrants this morning for all surveillance equipment and files. Blackwater has to turn over every photo, video, and report they've compiled on Becca. Grace leaned forward with interest. Can they refuse to comply? They can try, but they're already on thin ice with the state licensing board for previous ethical violations. Judge Walsh made it clear that non-compliance would result in immediate suspension of their operating license. Max smiled grimly. Sometimes having friends in the system pays off. As Morrison packed up his materials, his phone rang. After a brief conversation, he hung up with a satisfied expression. That was Blackwater's attorney. They're complying with the warrants and terminating their contract with Jonathan Pemberton effective immediately. Elena raised an eyebrow. That was fast. Judge Walsh has a reputation in legal circles. Companies that ignore her orders tend to find themselves facing very expensive federal investigations. After Morrison left, the house felt different. The constant surveillance had been broken, and for the first time in days, Becca could look out the windows without seeing unfamiliar cars watching her. But Mac knew this was just the beginning of Jonathan's escalation, not the end. His phone rang, displaying Amanda's number. Mac, we have a problem, Amanda said immediately. Jonathan's attorneys have filed a motion claiming Becca is mentally incompetent and requesting emergency custody of the unborn child. Mac put the phone on speaker so everyone could hear. On what grounds? They're claiming her allegations of abuse are evidence of postpartum depression that started during pregnancy. They have a psychiatrist who's willing to testify that her behavior indicates severe mental illness that poses a danger to the baby. Becca gasped. But I've never even seen a psychiatrist. How can someone testify about my mental state without ever examining me? Amanda's voice was tight with anger. It's called a paper diagnosis, based on reviewing reports and statements from people who know you. In this case, Jonathan provided statements from friends, business associates, and even household staff claiming you've been erratic, paranoid, and increasingly unstable. Grace's eyes flashed with fury. More lies designed to turn the system against her. The hearing is scheduled for tomorrow morning, Amanda continued. Judge Walsh managed to keep it in her courtroom, but we need to be prepared for Jonathan's legal team to pull out every dirty trick they know. Mac was already moving toward his laptop. What do we need to counter their claims? Professional psychological evaluation showing Becca's mental competency, medical evidence that her allegations of abuse are credible, and testimony from people who can contradict Jonathan's character witnesses. Elena stood up decisively. I can testify about what I witnessed at the bank, and I know other bank employees who saw the same thing. Grace reached for her purse. I can provide character testimony about Becca's mental stability and family history, and I have more documents that might be useful. Mac looked at his mother curiously. What kind of documents? Grace pulled out another manila envelope, smaller than the first. Financial records showing that Jonathan has been paying significant sums to a PR firm specializing in crisis management for wealthy clients facing legal troubles. She spread the documents on the table. He's not just using Blackwater for surveillance. He's hired professionals to orchestrate a complete character assassination campaign. Amanda's voice came through the speaker. This is exactly what he did during our divorce. Suddenly, all our mutual friends were hearing stories about my alleged drinking problem, my supposed affairs, my supposed history of lying and manipulation. Becca looked overwhelmed. How do we fight against professional reputation destroyers? Max studied Grace's documents with growing anger. We fight with the truth, supported by documentation and credible witnesses. Amanda's voice continued. I've arranged for Dr. Sarah Chen, a forensic psychiatrist who specializes in domestic violence cases, to evaluate Becca this afternoon. Her testimony will carry more weight than Jonathan's hired gun. Grace nodded approvingly. Good. Meanwhile, I'll contact every person on Jonathan's witness list and remind them that perjury is a felony. Mac looked surprised. You know his witnesses? Grace's smile was predatory. Marcus, dear, I've lived in this town for 76 years. I know everybody, and more importantly, I know their secrets. Some of those people claiming Becca is unstable have their own skeletons that they'd prefer to keep buried. Elena was organizing documents. This feels like we're preparing for war. Mac's expression was grim. That's because we are. Jonathan's not just trying to discredit Becca anymore. He's trying to take her child. The afternoon brought Dr. Sarah Chen, a composed woman in her 40s who specialized in evaluating victims of domestic violence. Her examination of Becca was thorough but gentle, covering not just her current mental state, but the psychological impact of months of abuse. Mrs. Matthews, Dr. Chen concluded after 2 hours of evaluation, you show clear signs of having survived psychological trauma, but your responses are entirely consistent with those of a domestic violence victim, not someone suffering from mental illness. Becca felt relief wash over her. So I'm not crazy? Dr. Chen's smile was reassuring. You're not crazy. You're a survivor who's been systematically undermined by someone trained in psychological manipulation. The fact that you recognized the danger and sought help demonstrates excellent judgment and self-preservation instincts. Mac joined them in the living room. What can you tell us about Jonathan's claim that she's a danger to the baby? Dr. Chen's expression grew serious. That's a particularly insidious accusation because it plays on societal fears about maternal mental health. However, Mrs. Matthews shows strong bonding behaviors with her unborn child and clear protective instincts. The real danger to this baby comes from continued exposure to domestic violence. As evening approached, the team that had formed around Becca continued preparing for the next day's hearing. Amanda would represent her in court. Dr. Chen would provide expert testimony about her mental competency. Elena and several bank employees would testify about what they witnessed. Grace would provide character testimony and family history. But Mac knew Jonathan wouldn't go down easily. As they reviewed their strategy, his phone rang with a call from Detective Morrison. Mac, you need to know what we found when we executed those warrants on Blackwater's files. Mac put the phone on speaker. What did you find? They weren't just conducting surveillance on Becca. They've been building files on everyone in her support network. You, Elena, Judge Walsh, even Amanda from her previous case. Grace's eyebrows rose. What kind of files? Financial records, personal histories, looking for anything that could be used to discredit you as witnesses. They've been tracking your movements, photographing your activities, even monitoring your communications where legally possible. Elena felt sick. How is that legal? Morrison's voice was grim. It's not, which is why Jonathan's in serious trouble now. Using corporate espionage resources to intimidate witnesses in a domestic violence case crosses several federal law boundaries. Mac's tactical mind was already working through the implications. Morrison, how does this change tomorrow's hearing? It means Jonathan's legal team is going to be fighting on multiple fronts. They can't just focus on discrediting Becca anymore because they're also facing federal charges for witness intimidation. After Morrison hung up, the group sat in stunned silence for a moment. Then Grace spoke with quiet satisfaction. Jonathan made the same mistake that Thomas made 47 years ago. He underestimated his opponent and overplayed his hand. Mac looked at his mother. What do you mean? Grace's smile was sharp with old wisdom. He got so focused on controlling Becca that he forgot she wasn't fighting alone. When you attack an entire network of people who care about each other, you don't just face one opponent, you face all of them. Elena nodded slowly. And some of us have been through this before. Becca, who had been quiet during the strategic discussions, finally spoke. I can't believe he would go this far. Part of me still remembers the man I thought I married. Amanda's voice came through the phone, which was still connected. Becca, that man never existed. What you remember was a carefully constructed performance designed to make you fall in love with an illusion. Grace reached over and took Becca's hand. Sweetheart, grieving the loss of who you thought he was is normal, but don't let that grief make you forget who he really is. As they prepared for bed, Mac did a final security check of the house. The surveillance vehicles were gone, but he knew Jonathan wouldn't give up easily. Tomorrow's hearing would determine whether Becca could keep her child and her freedom, or whether Jonathan's money and connections would allow him to continue controlling her life. But for the first time since this battle began, Mac felt confident about their chances. They had the truth, they had evidence, and they had each other. Jonathan Pemberton was about to learn that some fights couldn't be won with money. Some fights had to be won with justice. The family courtroom was packed by 8 a.m., an unusual crowd for what should have been a routine protective order hearing. Mac recognized several faces from Jonathan's social circle, clearly present to show support for his claims about Becca's mental instability. But he also saw Elena, several bank employees, and other supporters who had come to stand with his niece. Judge Walsh took her seat with the bearing of someone who had seen every legal trick in the book and wasn't impressed by theatrics. This hearing concerns the emergency motion filed by Mr. Pemberton's legal team, claiming Mrs. Matthews is mentally incompetent and poses a danger to her unborn child. Jonathan sat at the plaintiff's table with two expensive attorneys, his appearance perfectly crafted to project concerned husband and father. He wore a conservative navy suit and maintained an expression of worried sadness that Mac recognized as pure performance. Becca sat beside Amanda at the defendant's table, wearing a simple maternity dress that Grace had chosen to emphasize her pregnancy and vulnerability. She looked nervous but determined, her hands folded protectively over her belly. Jonathan's lead attorney, Martin Crawford, rose to present their case. Your Honor, my client is deeply concerned about his wife's deteriorating mental state and the potential danger to their unborn child. Crawford presented a series of statements from people claiming to have witnessed Becca's erratic behavior over recent months. A housekeeper who said Becca talked to herself and seemed paranoid. A neighbor who claimed she'd seen Becca having angry conversations with no one present. Friends who said she'd become withdrawn and suspicious. Mac watched the proceedings with growing anger, recognizing the coordinated nature of the testimony. These weren't independent observations, but carefully crafted lies designed to paint Becca as mentally unstable. Crawford's final witness was Dr. Richard Hartley, a psychiatrist who had never examined Becca, but was prepared to offer an expert opinion based on the statements provided. Dr. Hartley, Crawford asked, based on your review of the evidence, what is your professional opinion about Mrs. Matthews' mental state? Dr. Hartley, a pompous man in his 60s, spoke with false authority. The pattern described by multiple witnesses is consistent with postpartum psychosis that has manifested during pregnancy. Mrs. Matthews appears to be suffering from paranoid delusions, particularly focused on her husband's alleged abusive behavior. Mac felt Becca tense beside him as the doctor continued his character assassination disguised as medical testimony. In my professional opinion, Mrs. Matthews poses a clear danger to her unborn child and requires immediate psychiatric intervention. The baby should be placed in protective custody at birth to ensure its safety. When Crawford finished, Judge Walsh turned to Amanda. Counsel, you may present your response. Amanda rose with calm confidence. Your Honor, the plaintiff's case is built entirely on fabricated testimony and junk science designed to weaponize the legal system against a domestic violence victim. She called Elena as her first witness. Elena testified about what she had observed at the bank. Jonathan's aggressive behavior, Becca's visible injuries, and the clear signs of domestic violence that she recognized from her own experience. Next came Dr. Patricia Henley, who described Becca's medical condition after the bank incident and provided professional documentation of the abuse injuries. Dr. Henley, Amanda asked, in your medical opinion, did Mrs. Matthews show any signs of mental illness or incompetency when you treated her? None whatsoever. She was traumatized and frightened, which are normal responses to domestic violence, but she was completely lucid, coherent, and appropriately concerned for her baby's welfare. Amanda's final witness was Dr. Sarah Chen, whose forensic psychiatry credentials far exceeded those of Jonathan's hired expert. Dr. Chen, you conducted a comprehensive psychological evaluation of Mrs. Matthews yesterday. What were your findings? Dr. Chen spoke with quiet authority. Mrs. Matthews shows no signs of mental illness, psychosis, or incompetency. She exhibits symptoms consistent with someone who has survived systematic psychological and physical abuse, including hypervigilance, anxiety, and trust issues. These are normal trauma responses, not mental illness. Amanda approached the witness stand. Dr. Chen, the plaintiff's expert, testified that Mrs. Matthews suffers from paranoid delusions about abuse that never occurred. How do you respond to that assessment? Dr. Chen's expression hardened. That assessment is not only professionally irresponsible, but potentially dangerous. Dismissing documented domestic violence as paranoid delusions perpetuates exactly the kind of victim blaming that prevents abuse survivors from seeking help. But Amanda wasn't finished. Your Honor, I'd like to call one additional witness, Grace Sullivan. Grace rose from the gallery with the dignity of 7 decades of hard-earned wisdom. As she took the oath, Mac noticed several people in Jonathan's section shift uncomfortably in their seats. Mrs. Sullivan, Amanda began, you are Mrs. Matthews' grandmother and have known her since birth. Can you tell the court about her mental stability and character? Grace's voice carried the authority of absolute truth. Rebecca has always been one of the most level-headed, responsible young women I've ever known. She was an excellent teacher, beloved by her students and respected by her colleagues. Mrs. Sullivan, have you observed any changes in your granddaughter's behavior over the past year? Grace's expression grew sad but determined. Yes, I have. She became withdrawn, anxious, and isolated from her family. Having survived domestic violence myself in my younger years, I recognized the signs immediately. A murmur ran through the courtroom. Jonathan's attorney objected, but Judge Walsh allowed the testimony to continue. Mrs. Sullivan, the plaintiff, has presented testimony from multiple witnesses, claiming Mrs. Matthews has exhibited erratic behavior. How do you respond to those claims? Grace turned to look directly at Jonathan's supporters in the gallery. I've lived in this community for 76 years. I know most of the people who testified against my granddaughter, and I know what kind of pressure wealthy men can apply to ensure favorable testimony. Amanda smiled slightly. Are you suggesting the witnesses committed perjury? I'm suggesting that people sometimes say what they're paid to say or what they're threatened into saying. But I'm also suggesting that lies have a way of catching up with people. Grace reached into her purse and pulled out a small recording device, especially when those lies are contradicted by recorded conversations. Jonathan's lead attorney jumped to his feet. Objection! This evidence wasn't disclosed during discovery. Judge Walsh looked intrigued. Mrs. Sullivan, what exactly is on that recording? Grace's smile was sharp with satisfaction. A conversation I had yesterday evening with Mrs. Patricia Henderson, who testified that she witnessed my granddaughter's erratic behavior. In this conversation, Mrs. Henderson admits that she was paid $5,000 by Mr. Pemberton's representatives to provide false testimony. The courtroom erupted. Jonathan's face went white as his carefully constructed case began crumbling around him. Judge Walsh called for order and demanded to hear the recording. Mrs. Henderson's voice came through clearly. Grace, I'm so sorry. I needed the money for my mother's medical bills, but I know what I did was wrong. Jonathan's people said they just needed me to describe some odd behavior, that it would help him get custody of the baby for its own protection. As the recording continued, Mrs. Henderson described how she had been coached on what to say, provided with specific details about Becca's supposed erratic behavior, and warned not to discuss her testimony with anyone. When the recording ended, Judge Walsh's expression was thunderous. Mr. Crawford, I'm ordering an immediate investigation into witness tampering and perjury in this case. But Amanda wasn't finished with her surprise evidence. Your Honor, I have additional recordings of similar conversations with other witnesses who were paid to provide false testimony against Mrs. Matthews. Jonathan started to rise from his seat, but his attorney grabbed his arm. Mac could see the panic in the millionaire's eyes as he realized his carefully orchestrated plan was collapsing. Judge Walsh called for a recess to review the new evidence. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Jonathan finally lost his composure completely. This is insane, he shouted at his attorneys. How could that old woman have recordings? How could she have known to record those conversations? Mac stepped forward, his military bearing making him appear larger and more intimidating than his actual size. Because she's been investigating you for months, Jonathan. She knew exactly what kind of man you are. Jonathan's face contorted with rage as he turned toward Mac. You have no right to interfere in my marriage. Rebecca is my wife, and that baby is my child. Actually, Detective Morrison's voice came from behind them as he approached with 2 uniformed officers. Mrs. Matthews is a domestic violence victim under the protection of the court, and you've been violating that protection repeatedly. Morrison held up an arrest warrant. Jonathan Pemberton, you're under arrest for witness tampering, perjury, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violation of a protective order. As the handcuffs clicked around Jonathan's wrists, he continued shouting, "This won't stick! I have the best lawyers money can buy. I'll destroy all of you." Max stepped closer, his voice quiet but carrying the authority of 30 years of military command. "Son, you just threatened witnesses and court officers in front of multiple law enforcement personnel. The best lawyers in the world can't fix that level of stupid." When court reconvened, Judge Walsh had reviewed all of Grace's recordings and supporting documentation. Her ruling was swift and decisive. The evidence clearly shows that the plaintiff orchestrated a campaign of witness tampering and perjury designed to manipulate this court into removing a child from its mother based on fabricated claims of mental illness. She turned toward the table where Jonathan's attorney sat alone, their client having been led away in handcuffs. "Not only is the motion for emergency custody denied, I'm extending the protective order indefinitely and referring this matter to the district attorney for prosecution of multiple felony charges." Judge Walsh's expression softened as she looked at Becca. "Mrs. Matthews, I want you to understand that this court recognizes you as a victim of domestic violence who showed remarkable courage in seeking help. Your child will remain with you, and the state will provide whatever resources you need to ensure both your safety." As they left the courthouse, Becca was crying with relief while Grace maintained the satisfied expression of someone whose careful planning had achieved perfect results. "Grandma Grace," Max said as they walked to their cars, "how did you know to record those conversations?" Grace's smile was mysterious. "Marcus, when you've lived as long as I have and seen as much as I've seen, you learn to prepare for every possibility. I've been recording conversations with suspicious people for decades." Elena shook her head in amazement. "You single-handedly destroyed Jonathan's entire legal strategy." Grace's expression grew serious. "I didn't do it single-handedly. We all did it together. That's what family means, what community means. We protect each other." As they drove back to the rental house, Mac reflected on the morning's events. Jonathan's arrest had been broadcast on local news, and his reputation was in ruins. The expensive lawyers, the paid witnesses, the professional surveillance, all of it had backfired spectacularly. But more than Jonathan's downfall, Mac was amazed by the network of people who had rallied to protect Becca. Elena, who had recognized abuse from her own experience. Amanda, who had turned her survival into advocacy for others. Dr. Henley, who had documented the truth despite potential professional consequences. Judge Walsh, who had seen through the manipulation and protected the victim. And most of all, Grace, who had spent months quietly building an unshakable case based on truth and justice. Jonathan Pemberton had thought he could use his wealth and connections to destroy an isolated, frightened woman. Instead, he had discovered that some women aren't as isolated as they appear, and some fights can't be won with money. The prosecutorial machinery of justice moved with surprising speed once Jonathan's arrest became public knowledge. Within 48 hours, District Attorney Michael Torres had assembled a task force specifically dedicated to investigating what media outlets were already calling the Pemberton domestic violence conspiracy. Max sat in the DA's conference room, reviewing evidence that had been accumulating for months. Financial records showed that Jonathan had paid over $50,000 to various individuals for false testimony, witness intimidation, and character assassination services. The scope of his systematic abuse of the legal system was staggering. "General Sullivan," DA Torres said, spreading additional documents across the table, "we're looking at multiple felony charges, including witness tampering, perjury, conspiracy to commit fraud, domestic violence, and violation of protective orders." "But there's more." Mac looked up from the financial records. "What else?" "The federal investigation into Blackwater Security Solutions has uncovered evidence that Mr. Pemberton used their services to intimidate witnesses in his previous divorce as well. We're talking about a pattern spanning at least 4 years." Detective Morrison entered the conference room carrying a thick file. "It gets worse. We found evidence that Jonathan has been systematically using corporate resources to silence multiple victims over the past decade." Torres nodded grimly. 3 former employees, 2 ex-girlfriends, and his first wife. All threatened, intimidated, or paid off to prevent them from pursuing legal action or speaking publicly about his behavior. Mac felt a cold anger settling in his chest. "How many victims are we talking about?" Morrison consulted his notes. "At least 8 women that we can document, Probably more that we haven't found yet. Jonathan's been operating like a serial predator with unlimited resources to cover his tracks. The conference room door opened, and Amanda entered with Judge Walsh and Elena. Amanda's expression was grim but determined. "Gentlemen," Judge Walsh said, taking a seat at the table, "we need to discuss how to handle this case in a way that protects all the victims while ensuring justice is served." DA Torres leaned forward. "Your Honor, what are you thinking?" "I'm thinking we need to do this right. No plea bargains, no reduced charges, no quiet settlements. Mr. Pemberton has spent years manipulating the system to escape consequences for his actions. That ends now." Elena pulled out her own file folder. "I've been contacted by 2 of Jonathan's former employees who are willing to testify about workplace harassment and intimidation. The bank's victim assistance program has connected me with other women who have similar stories." Max studied the growing pile of evidence. "How solid is the case against him?" Morrison smiled grimly. "Ironically, his wealth and arrogance worked against him. Because he could afford professional services, there's an extensive paper trail. Contracts with Blackwater, payments to witnesses, communications with attorneys discussing witness intimidation strategies." Amanda nodded. "He documented his own crimes because he never thought anyone would have the resources or courage to investigate him thoroughly." Judge Walsh's expression was satisfied. "And he never anticipated facing a coordinated response from people who understood exactly what they were dealing with." Over the next several hours, they worked together to build a comprehensive prosecution strategy. Each victim would have the opportunity to testify, supported by documentary evidence and expert testimony about domestic violence patterns. The case would be tried in Judge Walsh's courtroom, ensuring that Jonathan's legal team couldn't manipulate the proceedings. But Mac was most impressed by what had happened to Becca during the week since Jonathan's arrest. With the immediate threat removed and a strong support network around her, she had begun to reclaim her life with remarkable determination. She had enrolled in online classes to complete her teaching certification renewal. She had started attending a support group for domestic violence survivors led by Dr. Sarah Chen. Most importantly, she had begun making decisions about her future based on her own desires rather than fear of Jonathan's reactions. That evening, Mac found her in Elena's living room reviewing college catalogs and job applications. "Planning your next steps?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her. Becca looked up with a smile that reminded Mac of the confident young woman she had been before Jonathan entered her life. "I want to go back to teaching, but I also want to study counseling psychology. After everything that's happened, I think I could help other women recognize the signs of abuse before it gets as bad as mine did." Mac felt proud of his niece's resilience. "That sounds like an excellent plan. Uncle Mac, I need to ask you something." Becca's expression grew serious. "Why didn't Jonathan's money and connections work the way he expected them to?" Mac considered the question carefully. "Because he made a fundamental strategic error. He assumed that wealth and intimidation would isolate you and make you helpless. But instead of facing one frightened woman with no resources, he ended up facing an entire network of people who had resources he couldn't buy." "What kind of resources?" "Professional expertise, personal experience with abuse, institutional knowledge of the legal system, and most importantly, the moral authority that comes from fighting for justice rather than personal gain." Becca nodded slowly. "Amanda told me something similar. She said that Jonathan's biggest weakness was that he never understood the difference between power and strength. Smart woman, power can be bought, borrowed, or stolen, but strength has to be earned through surviving challenges and choosing to help others face similar challenges." Grace emerged from the kitchen carrying tea for everyone. At 76, she moved with the energy of someone who had found new purpose in fighting for her family. "Any word on when the trial will begin?" she asked. Mac consulted his notes from the DA's meeting. "Torres is pushing for a fast trial date, probably within the next 6 weeks. Jonathan's legal team will try to delay, but Judge Walsh isn't inclined to give them much leeway." Elena joined them from her home office where she had been coordinating with other victims. "I just got off the phone with 2 more women who want to testify. Jonathan's arrest has given others the courage to come forward." Grace's expression was satisfied. "Good. It's time for all his chickens to come home to roost." Over the following weeks, Mac watched with amazement as the prosecution built an overwhelming case against Jonathan. The evidence was so extensive that his high-priced legal team began discussing plea bargain possibilities. But DA Torres held firm to his commitment to Judge Walsh. No deals, no reduced charges. The media coverage was extensive but respectful to the victims. Rather than sensationalizing the abuse, reporters focused on the systematic nature of Jonathan's crimes and the courage of the women who had come forward to testify. Mack was particularly impressed by an investigative series written by journalist Sarah Peterson, who had spent weeks documenting how wealthy abusers use corporate resources and legal manipulation to silence their victims. The article sparked conversations about legislative changes to prevent similar cases in the future. 3 weeks before the trial, Mack received a call from his former commanding officer, General Patricia Stone, now working in Pentagon oversight of military justice systems. "Mack, I've been following the news about your niece's case. I wanted you to know that what you've done has caught attention at the highest levels of military leadership." Mack was surprised. "In what way?" "The systematic approach you use to document abuse, build a support network, and coordinate with civilian law enforcement is being studied as a model for how military families should handle domestic violence cases." "I was just protecting my family." General Stone's voice carried respect. "You were applying military principles to civilian challenges, and the results speak for themselves. The Joint Chiefs are considering adopting some of your methods as official protocol for supporting military families facing domestic violence." After the call ended, Mack reflected on how much had changed in just a few weeks. Becca was thriving in her new life, building independence and planning for a future free from fear. The support network that had formed around her had expanded to help other abuse victims in the community. Even Elena had been promoted to regional manager, partly due to her leadership in implementing victim assistance programs at her bank. But most remarkably, Grace had become something of a local celebrity for her role in exposing Jonathan's witness tampering scheme. She had been interviewed by several news outlets and invited to speak at domestic violence awareness events. "Grandma Grace," Mack asked her one evening as they prepared dinner together, "how does it feel to be famous?" Grace laughed, her eyes twinkling with mischief. "Marcus, I'm not famous. I'm just a 76-year-old woman who finally got to use everything I learned in 7 decades of dealing with bullies and predators. Any regrets about getting involved?" Grace's expression grew serious. "My only regret is that it took me so long to act on my suspicions. If I'd moved faster, maybe I could have prevented some of Becca's suffering." Max squeezed his mother's shoulder. "Mom, you saved her life and her baby's future? That's what matters." As they sat down to eat, Mac looked around the table at the people who had become family through crisis. Elena, who had turned her own survival into a mission to help others. Amanda, who had transformed her legal expertise into advocacy for abuse victims. Becca, who was rebuilding her life with remarkable courage and determination. And Grace, whose quiet investigation had brought down a predator who thought he was untouchable. Jonathan Pemberton had tried to use his wealth and connections to destroy an isolated woman. Instead, he had discovered that some women aren't isolated at all. They're surrounded by networks of survivors who refuse to let anyone face danger alone. The trial was still ahead, but Mac already knew they had won the most important battle. Becca was safe, the baby was protected, and Jonathan would never hurt another woman. That was justice served military style. 6 months later, Max stood in the maternity ward of Memorial Hospital, holding his 3-day-old great-niece through the nursery window. Grace Rebecca Matthews had been born healthy and perfect, weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces, with her mother's dark hair and what appeared to be the Sullivan family's stubborn chin. "She's beautiful," Elena said, joining him at the window, "and Becca looks radiant." Mac nodded, watching as his niece nursed her daughter in the room beyond. Becca had chosen to revert to her maiden name during the legal proceedings, and baby Grace would carry the Matthews name rather than Pemberton. It was one of many decisions Becca had made to reclaim her identity and her future. "Any word on sentencing?" Elena asked quietly. Mac checked his phone for messages from Detective Morrison. "Judge Walsh is announcing it this afternoon. Morrison thinks Jonathan will get the maximum on all counts." The trial had lasted 3 weeks and dominated local media coverage. Jonathan's legal team had tried every possible defense, from claiming the abuse allegations were fabricated to suggesting that the witness tampering was conducted by rogue employees without his knowledge. But the evidence had been overwhelming, and the testimony of 8 different victims had painted a clear picture of a serial predator who used wealth and intimidation to silence his victims. The jury had deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges: multiple counts of domestic violence, witness tampering, perjury, conspiracy to commit fraud, and violation of protective orders. The federal charges related to using corporate resources for stalking and intimidation would be sentenced separately. Grace approached the nursery window, carrying coffee for everyone. At 76, she moved with the satisfaction of someone whose careful planning had achieved perfect results. "Any problems with the press?" Mac asked her. Grace smiled. "A few reporters tried to interview me about the grandmother who brought down a millionaire. But I told them the real story was about women supporting women and families protecting their own." Amanda arrived carrying flowers and wearing the tired but satisfied expression of someone who had just won a landmark case. "Sorry I'm late. I was at the courthouse filing the final paperwork for Becca's divorce and the termination of Jonathan's parental rights." Mac raised an eyebrow. "He agreed to terminate his rights?" Amanda's smile was sharp. When faced with the choice between losing his parental rights voluntarily or having them terminated involuntarily while he serves his prison sentence, he chose to maintain some dignity. Elena nodded approvingly. "So he can never claim custody or visitation rights?" "Never. Baby Grace will grow up without any legal connection to her biological father, and Becca will have complete control over whether or when to tell her about him." They were interrupted by Dr. Patricia Henley, who emerged from Becca's room with a satisfied expression. "Mother and baby are doing beautifully. Becca's recovery is progressing perfectly, and Grace is already showing signs of being as strong-willed as the rest of her family." Mac laughed. "Poor kid doesn't know what she's in for, being raised by Sullivan women." Grace's expression grew mock serious. "That child is going to learn from birth that she comes from a line of survivors, and that her family will always fight for her, no matter what." Dr. Henley checked her notes. "Becca should be able to go home tomorrow if everything continues progressing well. Do you have everything set up for her?" Elena nodded. "She's moving into a 2-bedroom apartment near the college campus. Between the Victim Compensation Fund and Jonathan's seized assets, she has enough money to finish her degree and support herself and the baby." Amanda added, "She's also received several job offers from school districts that heard about her case and wanted to support a survivor rebuilding her life." As afternoon approached, they gathered in Becca's hospital room to hear the sentencing results. Detective Morrison called Mac's phone with the news. Jonathan had received the maximum sentence on all state charges, totaling 15 years in prison without possibility of parole for the first 7 years. The federal charges would add additional time. 15 years, Becca repeated quietly, holding baby Grace against her chest. "She'll be in high school before he gets out." Mac sat beside the hospital bed. "How do you feel about that?" Becca considered the question carefully. "Relieved, scared about being a single mother, but also excited about making my own choices for the first time in years." Grace leaned over to stroke the baby's tiny hand. "Sweetheart, you're not going to be a single mother. You're going to be a supported mother with an entire family backing you up." Amanda was reviewing legal documents. "The civil lawsuit against Jonathan's assets is proceeding smoothly. Between what we can recover and the Victim Compensation Fund, you'll have enough money to buy a house and complete your education without financial stress." Elena added, "And the bank has offered you a position in our new victim advocacy program once you're ready to return to work. It would combine your teaching skills with counseling training to help other abuse survivors." Over the next several hours, they discussed practical plans for Becca's new life. She would finish her teaching degree while working part-time for Elena's victim advocacy program. Grace would provide childcare support, allowing Becca to maintain her independence while ensuring she wasn't overwhelmed as a new mother. Most importantly, the support network that had formed during the crisis would continue as an extended family for both Becca and baby Grace. As evening fell and visiting hours ended, Mac took one final look at his great niece sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. The baby would grow up hearing the story of how her family came together to protect her before she was even born, how a network of strong women refused to let her mother face danger alone. In the hospital parking lot, the group that had fought together for 6 months prepared to go their separate ways, knowing their relationships had been forged in crisis and strengthened by shared victory. "Thank you all," Becca called from her wheelchair as a nurse prepared to take her back to her room. "For everything, for seeing me when I couldn't see myself, for believing me when I couldn't believe myself, and for teaching me what real family means." Grace kissed her granddaughter's forehead. "That's what we do, dear. We see each other, we believe each other, and we protect each other. Always." 3 months later, Max stood in Becca's new apartment, watching as she fed Grace while reviewing course catalogs for her graduate studies in counseling psychology. The space was bright and cheerful, decorated with photos of family and friends, rather than the expensive but cold artwork that had filled her house with Jonathan. "Uncle Mac," Becca said, looking up from her studies, "I've been thinking about something Dr. Chen said during my testimony." Max settled into the chair across from her. "What's that?" "She said that surviving abuse isn't just about getting away from the abuser. It's about rebuilding your identity and finding your purpose. I think I've found mine." Max smiled, seeing the confident, determined woman his niece had become. "What's your purpose?" Becca looked down at baby Grace, then back at Mac. "To make sure no woman ever has to face what I faced alone. To use my experience to help others recognize the warning signs and find the strength to ask for help." "That sounds like a worthy mission." Becca's expression grew serious. "I want to establish a nonprofit organization that provides comprehensive support for domestic violence survivors. Legal aid, counseling, financial assistance, job training, child care, everything they need to rebuild their lives." Mac felt proud of his niece's vision. "That's ambitious. Do you have funding ideas?" Becca smiled. "Actually, yes. Jonathan's seized assets are being distributed to his victims through the civil lawsuit. My portion is substantial enough to provide seed funding for the organization." Grace entered from the kitchen carrying tea and wearing an expression of deep satisfaction. "Using his money to help other women escape from men like him. I call that poetic justice." Elena arrived for their weekly dinner together, carrying groceries and news from the bank's victim advocacy program. "Becca, we've had 3 more women come forward this week asking for help with abusive relationships. Word is spreading that there are people who understand and won't judge." Amanda joined them via video call from her office, where she was working late on another domestic violence case. "The legal precedents from Jonathan's case are already being cited in other jurisdictions. Prosecutors across the country are using our documentation methods and witness protection strategies." As they prepared dinner together, Mac reflected on how much had changed in less than a year. Becca had gone from being an isolated, frightened woman trapped in an abusive marriage to becoming a confident advocate planning to help other survivors. Baby Grace was thriving in an environment filled with love, support, and strong female role models. The network of relationships that had formed during the crisis had evolved into something that looked very much like extended family. Elena had become Becca's closest friend and business partner in the victim advocacy program. Amanda provided legal expertise and mentoring in nonprofit management. Grace offered childcare, family history, and the wisdom of someone who had survived her own battles with abusers. Most remarkably, their story had inspired similar networks in other communities. Mac regularly received calls from military personnel, law enforcement officers, and social workers asking for guidance on how to build coordinated responses to domestic violence cases. "Uncle Mac," Becca said as they sat down to eat, "do you ever think about what would have happened if you hadn't been working at the bank that day?" Mac considered the question. "I think you would have found another way to ask for help. You had already reached your breaking point, and you were ready to fight for your baby's safety." Grace nodded approvingly. "The strength was already there, dear. Mac just happened to be in the right place at the right time to help you access it." Elena disagreed gently. "I think it was more than coincidence. Mac chose to work at that bank specifically because he was worried about you. He positioned himself to be available when you needed help." Amanda's voice came through the video call. "And Grace spent months investigating Jonathan, building evidence for exactly this kind of situation. You were both preparing to protect Becca before she even knew she needed protection." Becca looked around the table at the faces of people who had become her chosen family. So you're saying I was never really alone, even when I felt completely isolated? Max smiled. That's exactly what we're saying. Jonathan thought he had cut you off from everyone who cared about you, but family doesn't give up that easily. As the evening continued, they discussed plans for Becca's nonprofit organization, tentatively named Grace's Place in honor of both baby Grace and the grandmother, whose investigation had brought down Jonathan Pemberton. The organization would provide comprehensive support services modeled on the network that had protected Becca. The goal, Becca explained, is to ensure that no abuse victim has to navigate the system alone. Legal aid, medical advocacy, financial assistance, job training, childcare, counseling, and most importantly, a community of survivors who understand exactly what they're going through. Mac felt deep satisfaction watching his niece plan her future. She had not only survived a systematic campaign of abuse and intimidation, but had transformed her experience into a mission to help others. As the evening ended and everyone prepared to leave, baby Grace woke up and began fussing. Mac held his great niece while Becca prepared a bottle, marveling at how much the tiny girl resembled her mother at that age. Grace Rebecca Matthews, he said softly to the baby, you're going to grow up hearing stories about how your whole family came together to protect you before you were even born. And you're going to learn that real strength isn't about never needing help. It's about building relationships with people who will help you face whatever challenges come your way. The baby gurgled contentedly as if she understood and approved of the plan. 6 months later, Max stood at the podium in the community center, where Grace's Place had held its grand opening ceremony. The nonprofit had already helped 15 women escape abusive relationships and rebuild their lives with comprehensive support services. Ladies and gentlemen, he said to the crowd of supporters, donors, and survivors, today we celebrate more than just the opening of a new organization. We celebrate the transformation of pain into purpose, survival into strength, and isolation into community. He looked out at the audience, seeing Elena in her new role as regional advocate for bank victim services, Amanda representing the legal clinic that provided free services to Grace's Place clients, Dr. Chen leading the counseling program, and Judge Walsh, who had joined the board of directors. Most importantly, he saw Grace sitting in the front row, holding baby Grace while Becca spoke to reporters about the organization's mission and future plans. The story of Grace's Place began with one woman's courage to ask for help, Mac continued, but it succeeded because of something much more powerful, a community's commitment to ensuring that courage is met with comprehensive support. After the ceremony, as people mingled and toured the facility, Mac found himself standing with Becca in the children's playroom, where other survivors' children played while their mothers attended counseling sessions and support groups. Uncle Mac, Becca said, watching toddler Grace take her first tentative steps across the colorful carpet, do you think she'll understand someday why all this was necessary? Mac watched his great niece toddle toward them, with determination written across her tiny face. I think she'll understand that she comes from a family that believes in protecting each other, standing up for what's right, and turning survival into service to others. Becca smiled, scooping up her daughter as Grace reached her arms. That sounds like a pretty good legacy. Mac nodded, thinking about the journey that had brought them to this moment. It had started with domestic violence in a bank lobby and evolved into a comprehensive support system that was helping dozens of families rebuild their lives in safety and dignity. Jonathan Pemberton had tried to use his wealth and connections to destroy an isolated woman and her unborn child. Instead, he had catalyzed the creation of a network that would protect countless women and children for years to come. Sometimes justice looked like prison sentences and asset forfeiture. Sometimes justice looked like babies taking their first steps in safe spaces, surrounded by communities that refused to let anyone face danger alone. Mac held his great niece and knew that both kinds of justice were equally important and equally satisfying.